My name is Gurveer Dinza. I anchored the early morning news at the local Fox station here in Washington, D.C. I'm up with the birds, so literally, because I live out in Fauquier County, out toward the Rappahannock County line, so I have a 62-mile commute into the city every day. So I get up really early, and those of you that are up that early, bless you. So I'm delighted to be here today. One of my neighbors is Rebecca Holloway, who works for the Department of Justice, and one of her co-workers, Shirley Greitzer, contacted me and asked me if I would MC this event. And if you look in your program, it says, as of this printing, approval for me to do this was still pending. I used to work over at Channel 9 down the street, and there, if someone called and said, hey, would you like to do this? You said yay or nay. You know how things work, different places, different scenarios. So at Fox 5, any sort of request has to be made in writing. It has to run up the chain of command, which you guys know about, and then it gets a yes or a no. I was on vacation. I came in on Monday, and they said, okay, you can go do it. So I'm just delighted to be here today for the 13th Annual Holocaust Remembrance Program. We always say that we look at our history, we think about our history, we talk about our history, and we talk about it for a reason. One of those reasons is so that we won't repeat the mistakes of the past. And I know this is the 13th year that you all have done this, and every year we say the same thing, right? Look at the cover of your program. Never again. And yet there's a question mark by the again. Because more than 60 years ago, more than 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. And we said, that will never happen again. We as human beings can't allow something like that to ever happen again. And yet, there was Rwanda. And now, when you turn on your television sets, or you pick up a newspaper, or you pick up a magazine, what's on the cover? Darfur. And so we're saying, again? Is this going to happen again? So we're here today to not only talk about what happened during the Holocaust, to remember what happened, to say never again, but also to talk about what's happening in Darfur and see what we as human beings, we as citizens of this world community can do to make a difference. Because, we come for these events once a year, right? We all get together and we say, oh, we can't let that happen. And then you think it's somebody else's responsibility to take care of it. And I think that all of us gathered here can do something in our own small way, and perhaps that's why it's really important that we're all here today, to take the message that you hear today away from here and say, what can I do in my small way? When I agreed to do the program and when they said yes, I was sent over a copy of last year's program on a DVD, and I sat and watched, and I have to tell you, I cried because the stories were so moving. They were so real. They weren't lessons in a history book or something that you were watching on television, but they were just so real. And I cried, and I think a lot of you will probably be moved to tears by what you hear today. But again, I want to say to you, even more than the tears, let's take something more away from here. I have to tell you that growing up, I read about the Holocaust in my history class, learned about it in my history classes, watched documentaries on television. But it really wasn't until I was in junior high school that it became much more real to me. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. People always say, first of all, where are you from? I was born in India, but grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And I met a young man named Andrew Walsh, who is still a very dear friend today. And Andy's wonderful parents. He has his father, Ed, and his mother, Mimi Walsh. Mimi is this warm, wonderful woman, Jewish. Ed, big, gregarious man, Catholic. An odd pair, but just terrific people. And I learned that Mimi's parents had been killed in a concentration camp, and that she had escaped only by being sent to live with relatives in New York. And so for the first time in my life, what happened during World War II became very real to me. And Mimi never talked about what happened. So her pain was her internal pain. But for the first time, there was a face to what the history books had been teaching me. Today, we want to remember again the Holocaust and focus again what's happening in Darfur and say we don't want that to happen again. Last year, if you remember, if you were here last year, instead of having folks come up and give you a speech. We had more of a conversation with two survivors, one from Rwanda and one from World War II. And we want to try that same format again today. So let me tell you about the two people that you're going to be hearing from today. Dr. Ernest Fontheim can tell you about the terror within Germany. Members of his own family disappeared into Auschwitz in 1942. For 3 years, he endured near starvation. He was able to escape thanks to a very brave family, but specifically the son of that family who took a chance for truth and for what was right. And keep your fingers crossed, because we're hoping to hear from him. He couldn't be here today because of his failing health, but we're hoping, that's why we have this video screen up here, is we're hoping for a video teleconference from Germany so that we can hear from him today as well. Our other speaker today is Omar Ismail, born in Western Sudan. Since graduation from college, he's been very active in relief operations in his native land and has been an outspoken advocate for democracy in that region, and it's in the news today. So we're going to hear from both of them today, and I'm going to walk over, and you all just sit back and we'll have a conversation. Dr. Fontheim, we want to start with you, and if you'll share that microphone with Omar when it's his turn to speak, okay? First of all, your story is just remarkable to me. To be able to escape what happened in Germany. Your parents did not get out as lucky. I mean, it was horrible for your family. You were able to escape. Can you take us back to your time in Germany and what was going on and how you were able to get out? And hold the microphone real close to your mouth, because sometimes it's a little hard to hear when you don't. Can you hear him or no? No? I tell you what, let me give you this.
Hello? Yeah.
There you go.
But by the time the Holocaust started in the early 40s, we German Jews had been subjected already for almost a decade to Nazi terror, discrimination, and persecution from the day on that Hitler took power in January 1933, at which time I was only 10 years old. There were daily anti-Semitic articles in the newspapers. There was a slew of anti-Semitic laws that were promulgated, the most infamous ones, the so-called Nuremberg laws. The persecution culminated at first with the so-called Kristallnacht or Crystal Night, November 9th to 10th, 1938, when I was 16 years old. All synagogues, almost all synagogues in Germany were trashed, vandalized, some burned, and Jewish shops were broken into and vandalized and robbed. I went at that time to a Jewish school, and the school was dismissed shortly after the start, shortly after 8 o'clock, with an announcement by the principal that the school could not guarantee our safety. On my way home on an elevated train, it just so happened that the train passed by the synagogue where I had had my bar mitzvah, which is the Jewish equivalent of confirmation, 3 years earlier. A thick column of smoke rose from the huge cupola of the beautiful building. That gave me such a shock that at the next stop of the elevator, I left the train, raced back a few blocks, and joined the crowd that was watching the burning synagogue. They were held back by police on the opposite side of the street. The crowd was highly anti-Semitic. They were shouting all kinds of anti-Semitic slogans. I was in the middle of it. I was totally oblivious that I might be in personal danger. I was just hypnotized by the sight of the burning synagogue, and through my mind crossed the holy scriptures, the Torah scrolls, which are kept in every synagogue in a special ark. What would happen to them? Well, of course, they all burned to ashes. People, of course, tried desperately to emigrate, so did my parents, but most countries closed their doors. As an example, for the United States, which had a very small immigration quota, did not even fill that quota. Not even the number of Jews that could have been admitted under then existing immigration laws were not admitted here. After that horrible day, there was a slew of additional legislation restricting the freedom of Jews. We could no longer go to movies, to any entertainment of any sort, cultural events. Some friends of mine and I simply were not willing to live under these conditions, and we went to movies anyway, somewhat, I guess, ignoring the fact that what could have happened to us if we had been discovered. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler ordered the attack on Poland, and which was totally unprovoked, by the way. And 2 days later, England and France declared war on Germany. That was the outbreak of World War II. On that day, I saw for the first time my father break down in tears and saying he survived one World War, the first one, and by that time he was close to 60. He said he's not going to survive a second World War in his lifetime. Nobody realized that this was prophetic. It was, I think, for any child probably a tremendous psychological blow to see your own father break out in tears of desperation. And throughout my life, I never am forgetting that scene. In 1941, or already in 40 even, the German government started to draft Jews into forced labor, mainly to replace German laborers who had been drafted into the army. I was drafted to work at Siemens, and many of you might be familiar. It's today, again, a huge multinational company all over the world, also in this country. And at that time, they had a huge factory complex in the northwestern part of Berlin with many, many factory buildings. There were hundreds of Jews who worked there, maybe thousands, I don't know. But we did not work scattered over in different places, but in closed groups. And we were not allowed to walk through the factory area, for example, unguarded, which meant that we could not go on our own to the toilets. Every day, and I still remember to this day, at 9 a.m. and at 1 p.m., we were led by guards like a herd of cattle to the toilets and back. In case somebody had a call of nature at some other time, that person had to go get special permission from the foreman, and the foreman could say no. If he said yes, then he would assign a guard to take that person to the toilets. That was, of course, particularly humiliating to the women. Women were also drafted into forced labor, and they had to go to that male supervisor to get his permission to go to the toilet. In September I should say, the most important event for me at Siemens Harbor was that I met a beautiful young girl, a few years younger than I, and we have never been separated since that time. That was in 1941. Her name is Margot, and she's sitting here in the audience. And in September 1941, another law was passed obligating every Jew to wear a yellow Star of David on his outer clothing, his or her outer clothing, when in public. And of course, that was another way of harassment. And it no longer was simply possible to visit to the movies now. But a friend of mine devised a detachable yellow star so that we could leave our apartments where we were known as Jews with a yellow star, walk 10 blocks or so to somewhere where we were not known, duck into a house entrance, remove the star, and then emerge as honorary Aryans and go to a local movie theater where nobody knew us. In this way, we at least started to defy the Nazi regime and the restrictions. Although I must say, although that was also very dangerous, but in those, I was just 20 years old, you don't think so much of danger at that age. Shortly after the Jewish star, the yellow star was introduced, the deportations started. Where Jews were deported from Berlin to the east. At first, people who worked in defense plants were exempted from these deportations. As soon as the deportation started, there was a total breakdown in emotions and in morale in the Jewish population. Many Jews, in fact, committed suicide rather than permitting themselves to be deported to an unknown fate. The deportations were done under horrible conditions. First of all, it was never announced where the deportation trains were going, and even worse, once a person was deported, never did any mail or any other sign of life come back from these people. It was as if a person was deported, had sort of dropped into a black hole and was gone from the world. Nobody knew what happened to them, and that in itself had a horrible psychological effect on everybody. Many of the Jewish forced laborers I worked with engaged in a kind of wishful thinking that, well, the Germans need us and we are producing for the war effort, so they'll never deport us. Unfortunately, it was wishful thinking. And I remember one case, in fact, where a colleague of mine, also a Jewish forced laborer, appeared one morning totally dazed for work. The night before, when he had come home from work, he found his apartment empty. He had a young wife and a few months old baby. They were simply gone. There was no sign what happened to them. Of course, he knew the Gestapo had arrested. The Gestapo was a Nazi political police, the secret police. So I guess most of you must have heard the name. He couldn't even have said goodbye to her. He was simply left alone. My parents and my sister, I had a younger sister I didn't mention, with whom I was extremely close, and we shared a lot of personal secrets and confidential information, even that we wouldn't share with our parents, with each other. They were arrested on December 24, 1942, and I never saw them again. And you can imagine that day has defined the meaning of Christmas for me ever since. I decided that I will never go voluntarily into a deportation train. And Margot, my friend, she was an only child, and her parents had the same idea, and so we were able to secure a place in the countryside, a very primitive cottage, more like a hut, in a village about 30 to 35 miles southeast of Berlin. And we sort of moved in there under assumed names with forged IDs. Of course, it wasn't in such a cottage, it was not possible to live in hiding in a way like the Frank family did in Amsterdam. As most of you are probably familiar with the diary of Anne Frank, they were literally hidden and nobody knew they were there. In such a cottage you had to go in and out and so on. That was impossible, so we chose the opposite tactic. We just blended in, we had assumed names, we made up a family history. I was supposed to be the nephew of Margot's parents, and the story was that my parents had died in an accident when I was growing up, and I was then raised by my aunt and uncle. And we had to train ourselves so that we would, upon being asked by others, we wouldn't contradict each other and we wouldn't have to think what our Berlin address was, but would behave totally natural. We had, of course, the support of many people, many non-Jewish Christians. Otherwise, that would not have been possible. I give you one example that I mentioned because people think mainly of someone who gives you a place to stay. Well, that's important. That's the most important thing. But one support person was our shoemaker. Well, in Germany, not only during the war, not only food was rationed, but also clothing and even shoe repairs were rationed. There was a coupon, you could only have, I don't know what it was, a given number of shoe resoling per year. And of course we didn't have these coupons living under false names. But our old shoemaker was an old socialist and a committed enemy of the Nazis. And he told me I should just bring our shoes. He resold them and do it for me without any coupons. Now you can imagine what that meant. What if we hadn't had that guy? Our shoes would have fallen apart and then we would have been totally paralyzed. We had to get into Berlin periodically to make contact with our black market contacts so that we could get food. There were many other incidents that I don't have.
You know, I was going to say we're going to continue this discussion with you very shortly because I know that the Drossel family was so important in helping you survive what happened during the Holocaust there too, and hopefully we'll get Heinz via satellite here in just a few minutes too. Right now we want to turn our attention to what's happening in Darfur, so if you will hand your microphone over to Omar. You know, back then you didn't have cable news channels, you know, you didn't have 24/7 coverage of what was going on. Today you do about what's going on in Darfur. Can you talk to us about what is happening there and bring us up to date on what we need to know today?
Well, let me begin by thanking you all for being here and thanking you for supporting the cause of the people of Darfur. It is great to be here with you all, and thanks to my friend Steve Frank who made it happen. Thank you, sir. This chilling history we listened to, and I'm sure most of you are now getting emotional as I am. And also some of you are getting angry like I am. But then within that, there is also the story of heroism, the shoemaker, the person who comforts the children at night, and the women who huddle together and hoping that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And you, and millions like you around the world who see this every day. And they give support, and they stand by us. The cable news, the 24/7 coverage is great, but also sometimes ignores us. Because if you look at the news, what portion of that news is dedicated to Africa? What portion of it is dedicated to one of the poorest countries in Africa? And then to a region that is poorer than the rest of the poor regions in Sudan. I don't blame the media. I don't blame anybody who doesn't know. We hope that the people who know will do what they are supposed to do. I will come to that later. However, the stories are similar. The people are different. The time is also different. But the suffering is the same. The people of Darfur are different than the Jews. In their culture, in their color of skin, in their behavior, in what they believe in, and what they don't believe in. But at the end of the day, they are human beings, and that is the common thread that brings us all together. So they are the same people. And when we feel the fear and the suffering and the lack of sleep and not knowing what is going to happen tomorrow, or those of us who were deported, they don't know where they are going, and we who were left behind do not know where they are taken to. That is when the human being becomes a human being with real feelings. That is when you are at your lowest point of vulnerability. That is when your weakness shows. And that is when also, for some people, where their strength came from. The people of Darfur have suffered through the years. We all know their stories as of 2003. It's a painful story. And many of you saw things on the telly or heard it retold by people like myself. But nobody can give you the magnitude of that suffering. Nobody can show you what is inside those women who were raped repeatedly. The people in thousands, hundreds of thousands that were warehoused in what we call displaced camps and deprived from their God-given right to go out of these camps to fetch things that will keep them alive. Firewood, water, because the villages were burned and the corpses of the people killed were dumped inside the wells to poison them. So these people cannot come back to these villages anymore, or whatever that left of it. And they were warehoused in these camps. Yes, the international community is helping with food and medical care and things like that. But what agency? I would like somebody to tell me where this sign is, where there is an agency that provides dignity. I've never seen a sign like that in my life, because that is something you cannot give to people. That is something that they were born with, and they have a God-given right to have. We can keep them alive through so many things. But what kind of life? So that is the story of the people of Darfur. If anybody knows anything about the desert, and I've said this before in other occasions, you know that the desert is very hot during the day, and it becomes intolerably cold during the night. Those women have babies. These babies cry all day because of the heat of the day and the shortage of food and water and the shelter, because you have to be registered and given a number and then put into these warehouses that we call camps. Some of them are outside this system. By the time they get into this system, they suffer a lot for weeks on end, sometimes months. So these children do not have shelter during the day, and at night it is so cold. What the women, with their ingenious thinking, devised is digging holes in the sand, because the heat absorbed during the day will give these babies a little comfort to sleep during the night, while their mothers, some of them tormented with the scars that are unbearable. Not only raped, some of them were branded to carry that stigmatism for life. They will try through their pain to give comfort to their children. There are so many stories like this that it is going to be hard for every one of us to follow these stories. Some people like Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times tried to document this. Brian Stidle documented this. So many people, human rights activists, who are talking about this. And you, the people who took the time today to come here and to know more and to support these people, know some stories like this. And the perpetrators, like what happened in Nazi Germany before, it's again the government that is supposed to provide protection and supposed to provide services and support to provide dignity to its own people. This is not the first time that genocide happened in Sudan. And who is better than the people who work in media to know that the media ignore this? Because it's not part of the foreign policy. It's not part of the interest of the big conglomerates and the transnational corporations. So nobody follows the story. But today, we know that 2 million people have perished in the war in southern Sudan before the peace agreement was signed in Naivasha, January 9th of last year. We know 2 million people have gone. Nobody documented that. Nobody knows their names or faces or where they come from. Nobody knows what happened to the people they left behind in the refugee camps and the lost boys that we all talked about. What happened to the lost girls? Nobody even told their story because they were just left behind to fend for themselves. And the lost children that were not even boys yet or girls yet, they just simply died. Again, in the Nuba Mountains, there were like 500 to 700,000 people killed under the radar screen. Nobody cared. Nobody knew. Then came Darfur, and we vowed we will let everybody know. We'll document the atrocities like no other. We have a project we're working on, and thanks to Harvard University, they gave me a fellowship this year to go in September as a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government and work on the documentation of atrocities. And thanks to all people like you guys. Harvard is an institution that has a name. Many of you do great things. And institutions are nothing but people like you with great hearts who do great things and go unnoticed. Thank you.
The two of you, you said those people had no voices, but I think the two of you, I think clearly today speak for the people who could not speak for themselves. And I think, Dr. Fontheim, this is a good time to light the candle of remembrance, if you would do that for us, while we hear another musical selection from the band. How many of you have Kleenex out there? I don't know. Music is so, it moves you so much, and that was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful. That was Staff Sergeant Leanne Hinton. Thank you, Omer. Oh, goodness. I had said earlier that we were hoping for a video satellite hookup from Germany so that we could hear from Heinz Drossel, who was key in helping Dr. Fontheim and escape Nazi Germany, escape the genocide there. However, doggone it, oh, do we have them? No, doggone it, we don't. But we have pictures. Look familiar to you, Dr. Fontheim? Okay, hold on, let me give you this microphone.
Oh, well, this picture now is of one of the main villains, Adolf Eichmann.
Yes.
It's a title as SS Obersturmbannführer, which is the equivalent rank of lieutenant colonel in the SS. He was a high official. He was the top man in the Gestapo for Jewish affairs. He led all of the actions against the Jews. He was responsible for transportation of the Jews to the death camps and for chicaneries of all kinds and atrocities. And he has been quoted days before the German surrender to tell a colleague, at least he'll go to hell in the happy knowledge that he is responsible for the death of millions of Jews.
When you see that picture, I can't imagine what kind of memories wash over you.
I never had the doubtful, dubious pleasure of meeting the man, and Paulie just as well. But in fact, one barely knew his name even at the time. The Jewish organizations, which unfortunately for many of the bureaucratic actions was used as a front by the Gestapo, always referred to the Gestapo on orders, that is, as our supervisory agency. But everybody knew it was the Gestapo. And the Gestapo told them what to do. The letters went out on letterheads of the Jewish community, but the Gestapo was behind it.
Since we couldn't hear from Heinz Drossel, can you tell us tell us who that is first?
Yeah, very briefly. I had mentioned that we lived in that cottage in a village outside of Berlin, and we met people there and so on. Incidentally, one of the persons we met was socially, was the local Nazi party district leader. That came about because Margot's father was an excellent accordion player, and he loved accordion music. So he approached us and told us that every Saturday he has a big party at his house, and why don't we come and bring the accordion along? There'll be dancing. And so we oft went on Saturday evening to the home. He had not a primitive cottage as we had, but a sumptuous villa, of course. He had tremendous amounts of food that was just served buffet style, things we hadn't seen in years. And we danced with the Nazi women there and pretended to have a good time. Well, we had a good time, actually, at their expense. In fact, that's one of the ironic and humorous occasions. Another person we met socially were the parents of Heinz, an elderly retired couple. They were fiercely anti-Nazi. We actually never disclosed to them who we were really, but we socialized and met them, and at their house we secretly listened to the newscasts of BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, on which at that time was a death penalty in Germany. So you can see how anti-Nazi they were. In March 1945, 2 months before Germany's capitulation, we fortunately got wind of a rumor spread by a local Nazi fanatic that he had looked into our story of who we were and discovered all kinds of inconsistencies, and he believed that we were either spies or Jews. And he had reported us to the police. And of course that alarmed us tremendously. We had to get away on short notice, but without causing any suspicion. And so we got in touch with the Drossel family. Fortunately, the son, Heinz, oh, that's a different picture now, okay. That's actually Heinz in Jerusalem, I think at the Wall of Remembrance, where also his and his parents' names are listed. we got in touch with them and told them who we really were and so on, and they immediately offered us any help whatsoever. And so what we did is, in the dead of night, we carried all of our suitcases over there to there. They lived sort of 1 block away from us, and to hide it in a shed behind their house. These were our only belongings, clothing and everything. And then on the next morning, we left with an early morning bus as if going to work, but without any luggage. And they had a small apartment in the South Berlin district of Tempelhof, where we actually, Margot's father and I spent a few days, while Margot and her mother had some other place where they could temporarily find refuge. And basically that action enabling us to save our belongings and getting out overnight saved our lives. Heinz, who, as I said, who was on furlough then, left the next day for the front, but he still found out that the Gestapo had come the next day in a big black Mercedes to pick us up. So I wouldn't be here if Heinz and his parents wouldn't have immediately saved us.
Yeah, he was in the German army.
Yeah,
That's
he was
right.
actually, he was a first lieutenant. The
Right.
earlier picture in the German uniform, incidentally, showed him as a sergeant, a Feldwebel. Later on, he was promoted to first lieutenant. He wrote an autobiography. The title, translated into English, it appeared only in German, is Time of the Foxes. And he describes also why he was promoted and so on.
I want to talk a little bit more in just a couple of minutes about how you were able to walk around without giving yourself away. But we want to turn to what's going on in Darfur with you, Omer, for just a few minutes. You were moved to tears just talking about what's going on in your homeland. When was the last time you were there?
The last time I was there was 1989, when I fled Sudan after the now still sitting government, unfortunately, of the National Islamic Front came to power.
And what about your family? Is your family still there? Can you tell us what's going on? And before you speak, I'm hearing a couple of cell phones ringing out there, and I meant to say this earlier, but out of respect to our speakers today and our guests, could you please turn cell phones off? That would be nice.
Yeah, my family is still there, my mom, my siblings. The larger family of 7 billion Darfurians are still there, trying hard to cling to their land and to their history and to their culture. On the personal level, yes, we all suffer. However, I always look at it in the projection of suffering at the community level, because we all belong to that community, and the destruction that happened to the Jews happened to the community at large, 6 million people. Every individual has a great story to tell, great in its magnitude, as well as the details of what they went through, and also it shows, like our survivor here, the human spirit that can never be broken, no matter what these perpetrators do, no matter what they subject us to. Still the human spirit will guide us through, and we survive. That is why they are called survivors, and you have some of them here. And this is a testimony to the unbroken spirit of a human being. In Darfur today, 3 million people are uprooted from their land. 250,000 are living as refugees across the border in Chad. This is a technical definition. A refugee is a person who crosses international borders, so they are taken care of by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Those who are left within their border, the origin where they came from, are called displaced. It's a technical term, because they are still under the sovereignty of their own country. So dealing with them is going to be differently. The people who already crossed the border, we've seen so many people in Cambodia or from Vietnam or from many parts of the world where the people cross the border and they lived refugees for decades. Imagine yourself as a proud citizen of this great country, and you have to be subjected to being without identity. It hits you when you get in contact with other people. I went out last year to work on some of the efforts to work in Sudan, mainly the south of Sudan, and I wasn't inside the country. I was outside working from bordering countries. And then I was traveling, it still is, even though I spent all these years in the United States. This country took me in and gave me a place to stay. And I met my wife here, and my children were born here, 2 of them. And I'm grateful to it. However, I still travel on a refugee travel document. 17 years, and I did not change my passport. Not because I refuse to have a passport of this great country, but because I'm Sudanese, and I will remain Sudanese. Nothing is going to change. So I'm still traveling on a travel document, a refugee travel document, and I came to one of these countries to get a permit to work. And they answered back and they said in the letter, responding to the application by this stateless person, we give him like a month or so to stay in the country. So that it hits you when you find yourself stateless. And this is something that happened to somebody like myself, lucky enough to survive and to become a citizen of the world and to travel around. Imagine somebody who leaving their land for the first time, not leaving by choice, but they were pushed out and they were faced with this stateless situation. And somebody like this stayed in a refugee camp somewhere else around the world for 40, 50 years. Some of them born and raised with the title refugee with them. That is hard.
What is life like for your family there? Can you talk about that? What is daily life like for them? And how are you able to communicate with them?
I am able to communicate with them because they still live in my hometown, which is called Al-Fashir. That is for the last 400 years, is the capital of Greater Darfur. From the time even before Sudan existed, Darfur was an independent kingdom. So they are still living in that old town, and it is relatively safe for them. I communicate with them. I talked to my mom 3 days ago, and I was happy and proud that I was affiliated with Harvard, like I told you. And I told her that this is important because this huge university is going to give me the space to be able to document the atrocities that happened to the people of Darfur and continue my research on that I started a couple of years back. And she was thrilled. She doesn't know what Harvard is or where I'm staying, but she was thrilled that somebody, somewhere, is interested in them and their safety and the plight of the people there.
What does she say about what's going on in the area and fear for friends and the lives of people that she loves and cares for?
Oh, she fears tremendously, especially that my father was killed a few years back, about 9 years back. And until today, we don't know where his body is, where his grave if he had any. So she became very wary of us being away or the people that she loves and cares for. However, she always talks about the plight of the people as he sees them, because there are thousands of refugees came next door to her in the Abu Shok refugee camp in Al-Fashir, and she sees them every day. Her other siblings are somewhere in Darfur, my aunts and my uncles, and she worries about their welfare. But the biggest picture is always, what might happen tomorrow. Because what happened somewhere else, like what happened to the Jews in the 1940s, somebody said, that was too far. What happened in Rwanda, somebody said, well, we know about it, but for somebody living in Los Angeles, it doesn't mean anything. And then now the turn came to Darfur, and then everybody will think, especially somebody like me who went through it, who is the next victim and what we can do to stop that. That is the issue.
I want to talk to you about what we can do to stop it and where we go from here, but I want to turn our attention back to Dr. Fondheim for just a minute. You talk about just being able to walk around pretending that you are not Jewish, pretending you are not who you were. I can't imagine living daily in fear like that, looking over your shoulder and wondering who's going to be coming after you. How did you manage to do that?
Well, it might sound somewhat strange, but in the beginning at least, I felt myself sort of to be like an undercover agent, and I've considered it very romantic.
You were 20 years old.
20 years, yeah.
Okay.
And I was not walking around in fear. I did have a forged ID on a Code Aryan name, and it identified me as a technician in a very big, well-known defense plant in Berlin. So that provided an alibi also why I was not serving in the Wehrmacht, the German army, because people with that kind of background and position were exempted from service. I mean, there were others. The Germans are probably the most thorough nation in the world, and which has its positive but also its negative sides. There was practically an ironclad system of identification. It turns out this paper that I had, it was an ID from that factory that somebody had stolen a blank and then forged the name and put my picture in and so on, for a good sum of money, by the way. And but that was not enough. The Wehrmacht had its own paper, and everybody in the age bracket to be drafted, which I was in, had to have either to be a member of the Wehrmacht, or if not, then a paper by the Wehrmacht, by the army, to identify the reason. There were also other reasons than job-related, for example, physical. Somebody with one leg obviously couldn't serve in the army, or physical disabilities. These papers were almost impossible to get, and they were limited to 6 months. They were renewable every 6 months, so that was impossible. Whenever I was frequently controlled, and they always accepted the fact that I had that paper. I had actually already one sort of plan B in case they would have asked for the army paper identifying my deferment. And what I was planning to do is to go through my pocket, pretending to look for it, and then say, oh, I left it in the jacket that I wore yesterday. And then they could have said, okay, but the next time be sure you carry it with you. But they could also have said, well, sorry, we have to take you along to check you out, and that would have been the end of me. But as I said, it never came to that.
Were you able to determine what happened to your parents and your sister?
Not immediately, but the fact that the transport went to Auschwitz, that became known shortly thereafter already. But what was really going on in Auschwitz only transpired after the war. In the meantime, of course, books have appeared. There's one book particularly sort of like a diary based on the records of the extermination camp Auschwitz. And that transport, it left on the 12th of January 1943. It arrived in Auschwitz on the 13th of January 43. And there were 10 people who were selected out for labor. The rest were not even registered in the camp. They went straight to the gas chambers. And that was the fate of my parents and my younger sister.
Have you visited Auschwitz? Have you been there?
I have been there, I don't know how many times. I went there the first time in 1971. That was, I should say, I'm a scientist, a physicist, and I frequently went to international conferences in Europe. In 71 was the first and only time that I went to a conference in the Soviet Union in Moscow. And so I decided that would be my opportunity to visit Auschwitz. So on the way back from Moscow, I booked myself through Warsaw and then went from there to Auschwitz, spent a day and a half there, and then continued. And in fact, then I went to Germany to visit my friend Heinz before returning to the States. In the meantime, I have been there innumerable times. I had in the late 70s a research assistant who worked under me who was Polish. He was actually from the Polish Space Research Agency. And we became also sort of personal friends. And after he returned to Poland, he joined the Polish Space Research Agency and invited me over to give a seminar. And then he drove me from Warsaw to Auschwitz.
And how difficult the first time to be there?
It is always equally difficult. It is such a place of horror. In fact, I should say Auschwitz was a central administration. It was a relatively small camp. It was a side camps, and the side camp Birkenau was the one where the killings took place. That's a 1.5 kilometer, which is roughly 1 mile of a distance, which I once walked just symbolically. Just to visit Birkenau is devastating. That's all I can say.
You know, the Bible tells us that to whom much is given, much is required. And you're alive today. And I wonder somehow if you feel that you must speak about what happened to you and to your family and why talk about it? Why be here today? Why talk about the atrocities that happened?
Well, I feel a personal urge almost to do it. And I have started actually working to write down my personal reminiscences, I mean, just for my family. So otherwise my stories will, after 1 or 2 generations sort of be forgotten or at least be not known in all the detail that I can remember. The strange thing is I have a tremendous memory of those years. If you ask me what I did in 1983 or 81, there may be a few instances I do.
But those memories are so painful still. I mentioned when we were first getting started today that part of the reason we talk about what happened so long ago is so that we won't repeat those same mistakes, and yet here we go again, talking about what's going on in Darfur. I'm excited about your project with Harvard, but what is it that we can do? What is it that the United States can do? What is it that you want this government to do and other governments around the world to do to make a change in what's happening in Sudan?
I will start with the role of the international community. The international community is but a group of nations, like we individuals here in this place, and then we make this gathering. And that is the same for the international community. There are countries with national interests that will make them you know, do a deal with the devil. And that is basically what countries like China is doing with the government of Sudan, because they need oil. 7% of the oil that China brings, and it is going to grow, is coming from Sudan. And if we know the large consumption of China of oil, we know how much that is. And then that money is turned into weapons and more ways and means for this government to oppress its own people. So that is one example. Russia, for example, is exporting weapons to the Sudan, and these are basically the two countries. Unfortunately, they are the two countries out of 5 permanent members in the Security Council, and they are always there jumping for the defense, on defense of the government of Sudan, either by threatening to use the veto or by pushing behind closed doors to water down some of the resolutions that were put forth against this government. So that is the international community. However, countries like the United States, we see that there isn't much that the United States government has done in terms of political support for the issue of Darfur, or militarily, or recently, in the last couple of weeks, because of the closeness to close a deal in the peace agreement, which happened last Friday, by the way. And it will be disingenuous on my part to sit here and say that is the best deal that we had. But it's a step forward. We can move from there, and we can work towards a lasting, comprehensive peace. But the United States did not expend a lot of political capital trying to convince the Europeans, for example, who are almost mute about what is happening in Darfur, mobilizing them only of late, like we said. So this is important. On the humanitarian side, the United States is the largest donor, and that is thanks to you. That is your tax money that is going to the people of Darfur and keeping them alive. That is a very important role on the humanitarian side. However, the political side is important. Of late, the US is pushing through the Security Council, trying to get the Security Council to agree to the Blue Helmets taking over from the African Union, which is small, 7,000 troops, ill-equipped, lack funding, and they don't have experience in peacekeeping like the United Nations has. They don't have the eyes in the sky that could see what is happening on the ground, and help providing intelligence that will enhance the security of those people on the ground. We need that from an international body like the United Nations and the US now. Yesterday, Dr. Rice was in the United Nations advancing a resolution towards getting more troops to triple or more, maybe quadruple the number of troops that are on the ground today, with a Chapter 7 mandate. And for the people who are not familiar with that, Chapter 7 is important because it gives the troops the right to use force to enforce security for the vulnerable people. Because before, the mandate that was given to the African Union is very weak, and they are only observers, and they don't have the logistical support to be able to move, even to observe what is happening. I remember an incident in a place called Sharia around February, and the African Union camp is like 2 miles away from the place, and this village was attacked, and people died, and some of these people reached the camp, and they informed the African Union. It took them a day and a half to come and report, because they're also vulnerable. They are afraid for their own security. And they don't have the capability of moving rapidly to do these things. So this is the international community and the United States. The people like us, what can we do? And for that, I will give you a classic example. And then you make the judgment. You determine for yourself where you want to be. When the Jews in Germany were going through this, the world was watching. Some people even said it wasn't happening. Not only people like us, laymen and women who do not know, but sometimes international organizations, and I'm not going to name names, who visited Auschwitz and came out and they gave the Nazi a clean bill of health, denying that what is happening to the Jews is genocide. There were governments at the time watching, and they denied that this was taking place. Like there were governments watching what happened in Rwanda, and they turned the other way and they denied that it is happening at all. So here is what we have to think about. There are many young men and women in this place. 20, 30 years from today, they will have children. And those of you who are blessed with children today, I hope they will be blessed with grandchildren as well. They will look at you, and maybe in the history books they will read about what happened in Darfur today. And they will ask, as inquisitive children ask, they will ask you, where were you when genocide was declared in Darfur? I want you to look them in the eyes, straight, and say, yes, my son or my daughter or my grandson or granddaughter, I was there. And I'm proud to report to you today that I have done something about it. Thank you.
You wanted to say something, Dr. Fontheim?
Yes,
It's on.
I would like to say that I am extremely moved by the story of what's happening in Darfur. Of course, I have known about it already from the press, and I want to say that one of the lessons that I drew from the war years in Germany was that I always want to support those who are the underdogs and who are persecuted. And even if it's at my own risk. After all, I was saved by people like Heinz Drossel, and that wasn't just an abstract help. I mean, it was a hands-on help, and he and his parents risked their lives. To support Darfur doesn't even risk our lives. It just means a commitment. It might be with money, it might be by writing letters to senators or congressmen, if appropriate legislation is up in support of that, whatever the case may be. But to stand on the sidelines and just say, oh, too bad, it's happening, and then go about our business is unconscionable. We have to, at every point, support those who are being persecuted and to prevent